stop scrolling. What I'm about to tell you will either change your life or prove you're not ready for real freedom. Right now, at this very moment, there's an island in America where families are literally abandoning their homes, walking away and leaving the keys in the door. Not because of crime or disaster, but because they've given up hope. And you could move into one of these homes tomorrow for absolutely nothing. There's an Alaska island where you can buy 5 acres of pristine waterfront property for less than what you'd pay for a decent laptop. Not a scam, not a timeshare scheme. Actual land ownership for the price of a weekend vacation. And scattered across federal lands throughout America, people are quietly squatting in abandoned military buildings, living completely off-grid with zero rent, zero mortgage, zero permission. And they're getting away with it. Sound too good to be true? It is, but not in the way you think. These opportunities are absolutely real. People are living this life right now. But here's what the Live Free in Paradise videos never tell you. These places are cheap because they're brutal. They're available because they break people. They're abandoned because previous owners couldn't handle what free actually costs. We're talking about islands literally sinking into the ocean while you sleep in them. Places where winter darkness lasts 6 months and drives half the population to clinical depression. Islands so isolated that a simple medical emergency becomes a death sentence unless you can afford the $20,000 helicopter evacuation. But here's the truth that nobody wants to admit. If you're drowning in rent payments, crushed by mortgage debt, and suffocating in the cost of living crisis, destroying average Americans, these forgotten islands might be your only way out. Not your best option, your only option. The question isn't whether these places exist. They do? The question is whether you're actually built for the kind of life they demand. Because most people aren't. Most people quit within 2 years. Most people discover that free comes with a price tag they're not willing to pay. Today, I'm going to show you exactly where these islands are, what they actually cost, and what living there really means. No fantasy, no romanticism, just brutal honesty about the last places in America where cheap living still exists. By the end, you'll know if you're one of the rare people capable of making this work, or if you're just another person fantasizing about escape from the comfort of their heated home. So here's my challenge. If you're not serious about actually doing this, stop reading now. Go back to scrolling. Go back to complaining about rent. But if you're genuinely ready to learn about real opportunities that could actually change your life, keep reading. Because what comes next might be the most important information you'll read this year. Let's start with the most dramatic example. An island that's literally disappearing. Tangier Island, the sinking refuge. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that your home, your island, your entire community has an expiration date. Not someday, not maybe, definitely. Welcome to Tangier Island, Virginia, population 450 and dropping fast. Scientists have given Tangier 25 to 30 years before it completely vanishes underwater. This isn't climate change fear-mongering or worst-case scenario predictions. This is mathematical certainty based on erosion rates that anyone can measure. Every storm season, more land disappears into Chesapeake Bay. Every year, the island is measurably smaller. And the people who've lived here for generations are finally accepting reality. They're leaving. Here's where it gets interesting for anyone desperate enough to consider this option. Waterfront homes that would cost $500,000 anywhere else on the American coast? They're going for $20,000 here. Some families can't even find buyers at that price. They're literally walking away from houses, leaving them abandoned and available for anyone willing to take the risk. Monthly living costs run around $600 if you're extremely resourceful. You're heating with diesel generators. You're hauling your own drinking water because the island's supply is increasingly contaminated by saltwater intrusion. You're fetching groceries via ferry from the mainland when the ferry runs, which isn't guaranteed during storm season. what life here actually means. There's no bridge to Tangier. You are completely dependent on ferry schedules. When storms roll through, which they do frequently, you're trapped. No ferry means no escape. If you have a medical emergency, you're praying for helicopter evacuation that costs thousands of dollars. There's no hospital on the island, no doctor. The nearest real medical facility is a ferry ride and a drive away, assuming weather cooperates. The waterman culture here is still alive, but dying. Crabbing remains the primary industry, but it's declining as younger generations realize there's no future in staying. The entire population under 40 has already left. The people remaining are mostly elderly watermen refusing to abandon the only life they've ever known. They're staying until the end, literally. One couple bought an abandoned home for $20,000, thinking they discovered a hidden gem. For the first year, the isolation felt romantic. The endless water views were stunning. The tight-knit community was welcoming. The slower pace of life felt like stepping back in time to simpler America. But watching the island physically disappear year after year changed everything. They'd see neighbors pack up and leave. They'd watch storms claim more shoreline. They'd calculate how much land would be left in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Knowing their $20,000 investment would eventually be literally underwater, that reality wasn't romantic anymore. It was heartbreaking. They were living in a community's final chapter, watching a culture die in slow motion. So yes, you can live nearly free on Tangier Island. The barrier to entry is incredibly low. But you're not just accepting cheap housing, you're accepting a countdown clock on your community and possibly your safety. Every year you stay is a year closer to the island's disappearance. Little Cranberry Island, the frozen challenge. Now let's head north to Maine, where island living takes a different form of punishment. Little Cranberry Island sits off the coast with a year-round population of about 65 people. This is classic Maine, rocky shores, lobster traps, brutal winters, and communities that have been there for generations. The opportunity here comes through Maine's tax foreclosure system. When property owners fail to pay taxes year after year, counties eventually auction the property to recover what's owed. On remote islands like Little Cranberry, these auctions can yield incredible deals. Camps and small homes going for $5,000 to $10,000. Monthly living costs run around $900 if you're resourceful. You heat with wood you cut yourself from island forests. You fish for a significant portion of your food. You limit ferry trips to the mainland to absolute necessities only. Here's what makes Little Cranberry particularly challenging. Maine winters on an exposed island are no joke. We're talking temperatures that regularly drop below zero, wind that cuts through every layer you're wearing, and seas rough enough to cancel ferry service for days or weeks at a time. When the ferry can't run, you're stuck. No doctor on the island means any medical emergency becomes a potential catastrophe. Electricity is limited and expensive. You're running generators or relying on solar power that barely functions during dark winter months. And then there's the social aspect that nobody warns you about. These island communities are incredibly insular. Families have been there for multiple generations. Everyone knows everyone. Outsiders, especially people who bought property at tax sales rather than inheriting it, are viewed with suspicion at best, hostility at worst. One person who made this work described their first 3 winters as the loneliest period of their life. They'd bought a camp at a tax sale for $8,000, thinking they'd found paradise. The island was stunningly beautiful in summer, pristine Maine coastline, the kind of scenery that appears on postcards and tourism websites. But winter isolation was crushing. Ferry service became sporadic. Social invitations were non-existent. They spent months essentially alone in their cabin, burning through firewood they'd spent the previous summer cutting, questioning every decision that led them there. Eventually, after several years, they were grudgingly accepted into the community. But it required patience, humility, and a willingness to prove themselves repeatedly to people who had zero obligation to welcome them. It took years before they stopped being the person who bought the Anderson family's camp at auction and started being seen as an actual community member. The illegal option, North Manitou. Let's talk about a completely different category of free living, the kind that's technically illegal but happens anyway. North Manitou Island is part of Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore in Michigan. It's federal parkland managed by the National Park Service, which means permanent residence is absolutely prohibited. The island has zero official residents. But here's the thing about federal wilderness areas. Enforcement is inconsistent, especially during winter months when tourism drops to zero, and park rangers have better things to do than patrol frozen islands in Lake Michigan. Some people have figured this out. They camp on North Manitou for extended periods, months at a time, living in a legal gray area. They're not permanent residents in any official sense, they're just camping for a really, really long time. The island has abandoned historical buildings scattered throughout, remnants of the farming community that existed before the federal government acquired the land. These structures provide shelter far superior to tents, and people use them. If you were crazy enough to attempt this lifestyle, your costs could theoretically approach zero. You're camping on public land, no rent. You're sheltering in abandoned buildings, no construction costs. You're fishing Lake Michigan for food and hauling water from natural sources. Your only expenses would be supplies you can't produce yourself, maybe $600 monthly for food you can't catch, gear replacement, and emergency supplies. But let's be crystal clear about what you'd actually be doing: squatting illegally on federal land, hoping the National Park Service doesn't notice or care enough to force you off. Lake Michigan is dangerous, especially in winter. Storms can blow up with terrifying speed, and if you're on an island with no ferry service and no communication, you're on your own. The isolation is extreme. There are no other people around for months, no rescue coming if something goes wrong, and legally, you have zero right to be there permanently. At any moment, a park ranger could show up and evict you, potentially filing federal trespass charges that would follow you forever. One long-term camper who tried this described North Manitou as hauntingly beautiful, but ultimately untenable. They managed to stay for several months during winter, sheltering in an old barn and living off supplies they'd cached during summer. The solitude was profound. The island felt like stepping back in time, completely untouched and pristine. But the psychological weight of knowing they were there illegally, combined with the genuine danger of winter storms on Lake Michigan, eventually drove them off the island. They packed up before spring ranger patrols began and never returned. The constant low-level anxiety about federal charges wasn't worth the zero cost of living. Drummond Island, the legal path. Drummond Island represents something more accessible, a path to cheap island living that's actually legal and doesn't require squatting. This large island in Lake Huron near the Canadian border has about 1,000 permanent residents. It's accessible by car ferry, making it far less isolated than many islands we've discussed. And crucially, it has a regular supply of cheap property through Michigan's tax foreclosure system. Basic cabins and small homes sell for $3,000 to $10,000 at these auctions. Sometimes even less if the property is particularly remote or rough. This is actual legal ownership, not squatting or gray area camping. Once you own property outright, monthly costs can be genuinely minimal, around $650 if you're smart about it. You heat with firewood you cut yourself. You fish Lake Huron extensively for walleye, trout, and perch. Ferry trips to the mainland for supplies are limited to necessities. But here's what cheap actually means in practice on Drummond. Michigan winters on an island are psychologically devastating for most people. Months where temperatures hover around zero or below, wind chill makes it feel 20 degrees colder, and the sun barely appears for weeks at a time. Seasonal depression isn't just common, it's almost universal among year-round island residents. The ferry connection is both blessing and curse. Yes, it keeps you tied to the mainland for supplies and emergencies. But when winter storms make Lake Huron impassable, that ferry stops running and you're trapped. Medical emergencies require transport to mainland hospitals, either waiting for the ferry or calling for expensive helicopter evacuation. Employment on Drummond essentially doesn't exist outside summer tourism, which vanishes completely from October through May. If you're not retired or independently wealthy, you're surviving on savings or remote work that depends on spotty internet. One resident described buying a foreclosed cabin for $5,000 at a county auction, thinking they'd found the deal of a lifetime. In terms of pure cost, they had. Monthly expenses were minimal. They heated with firewood. They fished for significant protein. Life was undeniably cheap. But the first winter broke something inside them. The darkness, the cold, the isolation, it was more intense than any description had prepared them for. They made it through, but by spring they understood why properties go into foreclosure so regularly. People give up. They leave. They can't handle what island winter actually means. Alaska, where cheap living still exists. Now we enter the realm of true frontier living. Alaska's remote islands, where cheap land still exists but comes with challenges that make everything we've discussed look easy. Kuprianov Island sits directly across from Petersburg in southeast Alaska, accessible by a 10-minute skiff ride in good weather. About 20 people live scattered across the island in small cabins they built themselves. Here's what makes Kuprianov interesting. Land parcels are available through private sales and occasional state programs for $5,000 to $15,000. You're buying actual legal ownership of remote Alaska property for less than a used car costs. Building a basic cabin yourself using salvaged materials or basic lumber runs about $20,000 if you do all the labor. Property taxes are minimal, under $200 annually. Monthly living expenses, including propane and supplies, come to around $450. Total setup cost, approximately $30,000. Monthly ongoing cost, under $500. Compare that to literally anywhere else in America where island living exists. You cannot touch waterfront property on the East Coast for less than $500,000. In Kuprianov, you can establish yourself with savings most working people could realistically accumulate over a few years. But here's what that money buys you in practical terms. Southeast Alaska receives over 200 inches of rain annually in some areas. Rain isn't occasional. It's constant for 8 months of the year. Everything molds. Everything rots. Maintaining a cabin in that environment is a never-ending battle against moisture. Winter darkness lasts from November through February, with only a few hours of twilight each day. Seasonal affective disorder isn't a possibility. It's an inevitability unless you're naturally resistant to depression. Skiff travel to Petersburg, even though it's only 10 minutes away, becomes genuinely dangerous during storms. People have died making that crossing when weather turned suddenly. One resident described their experience. They bought land for $12,000 and spent 2 summers building a cabin themselves, investing about $25,000 total in materials. Their monthly costs were minimal, exactly as advertised. Petersburg meant they weren't completely cut off from civilization, but the rain never stopped. 8 months of constant precipitation, gray skies, and moisture seeping into everything. Winter darkness was harder than they'd imagined, even coming from the northern United States. The isolation, even with Petersburg nearby, felt crushing at times. They stayed. They made it work. But they were honest about the mental toll. Kuprianov is beautiful, cheap, and absolutely not for everyone. Prince of Wales Island represents the most realistic option for cheap American island living that exists anywhere in the country. Alaska's third-largest island has about 6,000 people spread across a massive landmass. Multiple small towns, provide basic services. The Alaska ferry system serves it, connecting to Ketchikan and the outside world. And most importantly, land is genuinely affordable. Property parcels on Prince of Wales sell for $5,000 to $25,000 depending on location and access. Building a cabin yourself runs $15,000 to $30,000. Property taxes are under $200 annually. Monthly living costs, including food and supplies, run around $500 to $700. Total setup cost, approximately $40,000 for land and cabin. Monthly ongoing cost, $600 to $700. This is achievable. These aren't fantasy numbers requiring generational wealth or Silicon Valley salaries. Regular working people with modest savings can actually do this. And it's legal. You own the land. You own the cabin. You're paying minimal property taxes to the state. You're not squatting or existing in legal gray areas. This is legitimate, affordable island living in America. But let's be brutally honest about what you're signing up for. Southeast Alaska weather is relentlessly terrible. Rain falls 200+ days per year. Winter darkness lasts from October through March, and the psychological impact of months with minimal sunlight cannot be overstated. People who have never experienced it genuinely cannot comprehend how darkness affects human psychology. Bears are common throughout the island. You're incorporating bear awareness into every outdoor activity. People have been mauled and killed by bears on Prince of Wales. It's not theoretical. It's real danger. Self-sufficiency is mandatory. If you can't fish, hunt, gather firewood, maintain your cabin, and handle basic repairs, you will not make it. The brutal truth. Here's what we've learned about free and cheap island living in America. It exists. These places are real. People actually live this way. But free is deeply misleading. At the extreme end, free means illegal, squatting on federal land where you could face criminal charges anytime. At the realistic end, cheap means significant upfront investment, $20,000 to $50,000, followed by minimal monthly costs requiring absolute self-sufficiency. Cheap means accepting conditions most Americans find unacceptable. No doctors, hospitals, or grocery stores. Brutal weather, dangerous wildlife, profound isolation, and psychological challenges that break most people. These islands are affordable for a reason. Nobody else wants them. Tangier is sinking. Little Cranberry has brutal winters and unwelcoming communities. Drummond lacks economic opportunities. Alaska islands have relentless weather, winter darkness, dangerous bears, no employment, and medical emergencies that can cost everything. But if you're truly done with conventional American life and the cost of living crisis crushing average people, these options exist. Prince of Wales Island particularly represents something remarkable. Genuine, legal, affordable island living for under $50,000 total and under $700 monthly. That's achievable for regular people with determination. It won't be easy. It won't be comfortable. But it's possible. Your decision. The question isn't whether these places exist. They do. The question is, are you actually capable of handling what they demand? Could you spend 2 summers building an Alaska cabin in constant rain while mosquitoes devour you and everything molds? Could you endure months of 4-hour twilight days watching your mental health deteriorate from seasonal depression? Could you handle being trapped when storms cancel ferries, knowing medical emergencies mean potentially dying before help arrives? Most people can't. Most quit within 2 years. Properties cycling through tax foreclosures are available because someone before you tried and failed. But some people thrive in isolation. Some find peace in environments driving others insane. If that's you, these islands represent an escape from housing market insanity and the cost of living crisis. You can buy Alaska land for $15,000, build a cabin for $25,000, own property outright, and live on $600 monthly. You can be financially free in ways impossible almost anywhere else in America, but you'll pay in isolation, weather, danger, and mental fortitude. So answer honestly, could you actually do this? Because cheap island living in America isn't a dream. It's a test, and most people fail. But for the few who pass, it's genuine freedom and escape from systems controlling everyone else. The islands are waiting. The only question is whether you're ready for them.